Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The government is publishing its much-anticipated white paper on our future relationship with the EU. The new Brexit Secretary, Dominic Raab, is making a statement in Parliament soon, after which the paper will be published. What can we expect, John Pienaar, that we don't know already?
Well, we haven't seen the paper yet. It's out in something under an hour. Then we can see the fine print for ourselves. I'm not sure we should expect to be startled hugely by what is in this white paper, because the policy underpinning it has been so discussed and in such enormous detail. I think there could be some points there that are worth looking at very, very closely when we get it. A couple of examples. When it comes to the relationship between this country and the European Union on services, including financial services. There was an interesting report in the Financial Times, which is very often pretty clued up on this stuff, as you know, Joe, that says that maybe Britain is scaling back its ambitions for the closeness of that relationship when it comes to services and financial services. It has been the case that Britain was looking for something called mutual recognition, which is a system whereby we can do our financial business with the European Union effectively on the say-so of one side or the other when it comes to approving and ticking all the boxes for some sort of transaction to go ahead. We may, if the leak and the suggestion is correct, have drawn back a bit from that. And I can imagine that will cause, if it's the case, a good deal of disappointment in the city and elsewhere in the services sector, which is, after all, 80-odd% of the British economy. Migration, fantastically sensitive area, has been for oh so long. You'd expect it to be rather vague, but not entirely devoid of any indication, because the new Home Secretary has made clear he wants a migration policy which will be bound up in the terms of the coming negotiation with the European Union, and the phrase labour mobility has been used. So we're talking about, at the very least, some sort of relationship where access is contingent upon business or the needs of the British economy. But that's an enormous, enormous space, and you'd expect it to be quite big enough for the two sides of the Brexit argument to lock horns, because they're going to be locking horns on just about everything, right, especially including.
And as you say, there's a lot to chew over, and we haven't even seen the detail within this white paper. But let's go over to Central Lobby in the Houses of Parliament, because we can speak to David Jones. He's a Brexit-supporting former minister. Welcome to the programme, David. So the white paper, we've been discussing it here in the studio. It's going to be published in a couple of hours. Are you excited, or are you dreading it?
No, I'm looking forward to it. I think it's important now that we have clarity. We've been waiting a long time for this white paper, and indeed it looks as if this is the second version of the white paper that was originally produced. So I think it's important we see it. Of course, we have had an inkling of what's likely to be in it in the communique that was issued after the Chequers summit last week. So I think we know the general direction of travel.
Right, and as you say, we haven't seen all the detail, but we do know that under this plan we'll take EU rules on goods and agricultural products. There'll be some role for the European Court of Justice, even if it's indirect, and there will be a mobility framework between us, just talking about that, labour movement, and the EU. How far is that from the kind of deal that you had envisaged?
Well, we were told repeatedly, and of course the Prime Minister herself in two important speeches at Lancaster House and the Mansion House did effectively draw red lines, which is no membership of the single market or the customs union, and no jurisdiction for the European Court of Justice. And it does look, if the Chequers communique is anything to go by, that there's going to be some blurring of those red lines, and that is going to be a matter of some concern.
Right, how concerned are you?
Well, I'm extremely concerned, because the country voted to leave the European Union, and leaving the European Union means no longer being part of the apparatus of the European Union, including Single Market, Customs Union and European Court of Justice. And I would be extremely concerned if we were not to get anything much less than that.
The Prime Minister may not be worried about your concern, with all due respect, or the concern of some of your colleagues. The Brexit Secretary has said today critics of this deal should stop carping and come up with some credible alternatives. What's the credible alternative, David?
Well, hang on, I haven't seen the deal yet. In fact, there is no deal. I haven't even seen the proposals for the deal, and I'm not carping about it because I haven't got anything to carp about, because we haven't seen anything yet. All that we're asking for, I think, people who are supporters of Brexit, is that there should be what the country voted for, which is a departure from the European Union. And I think in terms of what the alternatives are, I think a good starting place would be a Canada-style free trade agreement, which the European Union has already said we can have. There would be some negotiation quite naturally, but I think that would be a better starting place than what we appear we'll be seeing later on today.
I mean, critics of that would say that doesn't solve the issue with the border in Northern Ireland. And also, now, David, can you imagine or envisage the Prime Minister being able to go back to either Parliament or the EU with a different proposal to the one that she is releasing this morning? That just wouldn't be credible, would it?
Well, I think, we've got to regard this as initiating a debate within the Conservative Party, and believe me, there is a debate going on at the moment. And I think that the Prime Minister really does have to recognise that there is a great feeling on the side of the pro-Brexit part of the party that this may not be what they want, and she does have to discuss these things.
Discuss, and if she doesn't change her policy, what then?
Well, I'm not going to go into that, because I do believe that we do need this debate first.
Right.
This document today is a good starting point, and I've no doubt it's going to be pored over by people from all over the party, as well as, of course, the wider country.
How split is the party now, do you think?
Europe has always been a fault line within the Conservative Party, and I think that so far we've managed to hold together pretty well. We got the notification of withdrawal bill through with an enormous majority, and only a couple of weeks ago we saw the withdrawal bill go through. And I think that if the party does discuss these things and come to an accommodation, we can go forward.
Right. I mean, listening to some of your colleagues today, Marcus Fish, the Conservative MP, has tweeted, "Downing Street will give us Corbyn unless they change and change now." Do you agree with him?
I think that the sort of sentiments that Marcus has just expressed is a really good reason for the government to start talking to the parliamentary party.
But I mean, you cannot really change the policy and the proposal that's been put forward unless you change the leader, can you?
Well, I don't think that that's at all right. I think what we have in Theresa May is a very resilient Prime Minister who has delivered a lot of the Brexit agenda so far. And I've never regarded her as a person who you can't discuss things with. And I think that when she sees that there is a strong body of opinion within the party that has concerns, will want to discuss these things with us.
Right, take us through what's going to happen on Monday next week when the customs bill, which is a very important part of the whole Brexit legislation, comes back into the Commons. You are supporting some amendments to that bill.
I've supported one of the amendments, which is to do with the customs union, and in fact the amendment that I've signed is supportive of the government's position so far. In fact, I asked the Prime Minister on the floor of the House only last week whether we'd be in the customs union and whether a combined customs territory meant that we'd be in the customs union. She said no, it's a different thing. We would not be in the customs union, and the amendment I've put down actually requires that if there is any suggestion that we should go into the customs union, there would have to be primary legislation. So that is supportive of the government's position as it's enunciated it so far.
Right, and so you're hoping that's obviously going to get through on Monday.
So.
Pardon?
I would hope so.
And what about the plan as it stands, the Chequers plan? Do you think that's got enough support in Parliament to get through?
Well, I would think that the government has got to understand that the role of an opposition is to oppose, and that oppositions frequently will take opportunities to try to bring down the government. So I think that that's an important part of the arithmetic that we have to consider at the moment.
David Jones, if you can stay with us, do. John B and I are listening to that. Do you think the chances are of Theresa May listening? Yes. And changing her proposal to meet the demands that David Jones has politely sort of set out on this programme?
I think the idea of Theresa May willingly backing down to avoid trouble, that's not going to happen, but there's plenty of trouble up ahead. Sounds like a cue for a song, but there's not just there may be trouble ahead, there is a lot of trouble ahead, and this plan could founder in cross currents inside the Conservative Party, between the parties in the House of Commons, and for that matter on the backbenches of the Labour Party, where there are serious ideological differences on Europe, and where there are difficult dilemmas to be faced there too. As you say, early next week, they'll start debating legislation. They'll be talking about a customs union. David Davis and his like-minded Brexiteer colleagues will try and chuck a spanner into the works of the Chequers plan by kicking out, effectively, the idea of a common customs area, simply by saying, look, we're not going to collect your tariffs if you don't collect ours, which would blow an enormous hole in the hull of that idea and other things too. Meanwhile, those who were the rebels, who were saying, let's force through.
They're the
idea.
angels now.
They are, for the most part. Some of them, are still going to, I think, fight it to the wire, but most of them look like they're happy. They look very happy, and they're going to back away next week. But just as one front closes down, another one opens up.
Right, well, we're joined now by James Cleverly, Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party. Welcome to the programme. I don't know how much you heard of David Jones, but this idea of a common customs area being rejected by many colleagues, they've already signed amendments. What are you going to do?
Well, I mean, we'll have to see, as with all these things, we'll have to see what moves and ebbs and flows between now and when the bill comes before the House. But ultimately, the proposal that was put forward is a proposal that we think pragmatically balances what we promised at the referendum, which was to leave the customs union single market, not pay those big membership bills, and also the implicit elements, which is to be able to strike free trade deals and to protect the integrity of the United Kingdom, plus actually a proposal that we think would be acceptable, hope will be acceptable to the EU.
Well, is it acceptable to you in the way he's just explained it, James Cleverly? David?
No, I think we do have to look at the detail. At the moment, we're all speculating as to what's going to be in this white paper. There's going to be a lot of detail in it, and I think that, frankly, we need to study that.
But you've already said you don't sign up to the customs proposal as it is. You are not happy with this idea of collecting the tariffs on behalf of the EU unless it's reciprocal.
Well, that wasn't actually my amendment, but I actually do approve of that too. Well, of course, it has to be reciprocal. If we're going to be in a combined customs area, then they do have to collect our tariffs for us.
Right.
That of course illustrates the fact that what we've got here is not the last and best British offer. This is an opening position which is subject potentially to further concessions. And again, that's extremely worrying.
Right. Do you share his worry? Is this the opening offer that could actually lead to more concessions from the British government?
No, we've been negotiating this, and it's very easy for people to forget, as the conversation moves on, the things that we have already negotiated. So this is part of an ongoing negotiation.
So no more concessions now?
This is our proposal to the EU. Of course they'll come back with counter-proposals. Of course you do. That's how...
And you'll concede in a negotiation?
That's how negotiations work. But we are... this proposal is pushing the EU to do some things that it will be uncomfortable with. We are saying that we want market access, really good market access.
But no freedom of movement.
Because that protects jobs here in the UK. It's not about business, it's about jobs, but not freedom of movement. The EU won't like that, and we're going to push them on that because it matters to the British people.
OK, I mean, when it comes to free trade deals, which you talked about, in fact, in the Sun newspaper, Theresa May has said it's no surprise that countries are queuing up to make trade deals with us after we leave the EU. Can you name any 3 countries that are ready to go to cut and paste a trade deal without
New
further
Zealand,
negotiation at all?
Taiwan. Oh, without further negotiation at all.
Well, that's what said. They're queuing up to make trade deals with us after we leave the EU. They're not ready to go without further negotiation, are they? Any of these countries?
Well, no, but you're adding a caveat onto what the Prime Minister said. So I know for a fact there are a number of countries. Canada has already made it very, very clear that they're keen to do a trade deal. The United States of America made it clear. Australia's made it clear. New Zealand's made it clear. Japan's made it clear. Taiwan's made it clear. There are a number of countries around the world, and with a bit more notice, I'm sure I could have come up with half a dozen more.
Yeah, it's not quite as simple as that, is it, James? As I'm sure you must, of course. No, you mentioned Japan at random. Japan has put us really quite far back in the list of its priorities for a trade deal. Some of the countries you mentioned are saying they'll look for a deal with Europe before they come talking to us. And although you talk about Australia, I think Liam Fox, who's the International Trade Secretary, has said a deal with Australia is very high on his list of priorities. What Australia want, of course, is easier access to the market, especially for agricultural produce. Now, that would set many of our farmers absolutely aflame with anxiety and anger. Some of them, in Wales, for example, have said that if cheap Australian lamb comes into this country, they'll be driven out of business. So it's very far from being as simple as you suggest there.
No, trade deals are never simple, but I was asked, Joe asked me, can I name countries that are keen on a trade deal?
No, I didn't say keen on trade. I said, are they ready to go the minute we leave the EU?
Well, according to Canada and Japan, the two countries that are coming close to culminating their trade deals with the EU, those EU-based trade deals would be the backbone for trade deals with us. And actually, because those trade deals would be in alignment with the EU, it would be relatively straightforward, even under, despite what David said, even with these proposals that we're putting forward to align a UK-Canada, UK-Japanese trade deal with the ones that they're negotiating with the EU
David,
at the moment.
Do you accept it would be as easy as that if we're going to be aligned with the EU on goods?
No, I think it's a huge problem, and indeed President Obama's chief trade advisor was actually interviewed this morning, in which he pointed out that UK signing up to the EU's common rule book would be a huge impediment to a trade deal with the United States, which is the principal prize, is the biggest market in the world, and we're in danger of not having that free trade deal, which I think is extremely worrying. And I think what appears to be proposed as a consequence of the Chequers Agreement may well be very contrary and inimical to our interests when it comes to doing a deal with the United States.
All right, let's talk about this alternative Brexit white paper, James Cleverly and David Jones, if you can stay with us, from the Department for Exiting the EU. I think we can show you a bit of it now. David Davis, the former Brexit Secretary, had said on Monday that he'd spent the last couple of months on an alternative white paper to the one that Downing Street eventually published. And it says that the UK proposes that the future trading relationship should be underpinned by a comprehensive system of mutual recognition, which covers a broad range of sectors. The comprehensive system of mutual recognition would establish a broad range of reciprocal measures, allowing cooperation activity undertaken at a national level to be recognised in both the UK and EU markets. Compliance, sorry, not cooperation. What do you say to that, James Cleverly?
Well, I haven't seen the full details of that. I'm not going to. I've got one comment, one paragraph from a document. I don't know how old that document is. I don't know what version, what draft.
Sure, all right, but on the main term, mutual recognition, that's gone now, hasn't it? I mean, we're now signing up to a common rule book.
Hang on, Joe, with respect, one paragraph out of a massive document, the age of which I don't know, out of context with all the caveats and things around it. I'm not going to comment on it because any comment would be meaningless on just a paragraph out of context.
David, what do you think it's significant in terms of changing mutual recognition to the common rule book, which is basically EU rules?
I actually think that what is proposed there is a far more realistic proposition. It's very similar to the Canada proposal that I was talking about a few moments ago. And we know that that is something that the EU would accept. And I am extremely concerned that this document, which it would appear was ready to be printed very shortly before the Chequers agreement, has now apparently been junked. And I think that we do need to look at the details of that document very carefully and actually assess it and see whether that might not be more something that we would accept more than the document that is going to be published in the course of the next few minutes.
Let's talk about the Conservative Party. We were speaking to David Jones a little earlier about the state of the party, about how unhappy so many people, whether it's at grassroots level or MPs or resigning ministers. How much damage has been done to the Prime Minister's authority? She's lost 2 cabinet ministers. She's lost a Brexit minister. 2 of your colleagues, vice chairman of the Conservative Party, have resigned too, and grassroots Tories in many parts of the country are furious.
It's never good. It's never good when you lose parliamentary colleagues from ministerial positions or indeed party positions, as we've had, and it self-evidently would have been better if we hadn't. But ultimately, I speak to a lot of backbench colleagues. It's naturally part of my job, as well as a lot of members of the Conservative Party around the country, and a lot of them had concerns and disquiet about things that weren't in the proposal. So they were getting angry about things which had been reported, so claims that we weren't going to have control over immigration when we were, the idea of us staying in the customs union when we were leaving. So, and when I've spoken to people, I've said, look, let's remind ourselves what we campaigned on. Those of us that campaigned for leave, as I did, let's remind ourselves what we campaigned on. The big 3 issues that we campaigned on: taking control of our money, taking control of our borders, and taking control of our laws. All 3 of those things are delivered in this proposal.
But you haven't been able to convince quite key people in the cabinet and on the backbenches.
Well, I respect. I just disagree with them because because I was very keen. I was very, very clear in what I was campaigning on, and the things that I campaigned on are being delivered in this proposal. There are other things now which people are saying, oh, well, you know, this other thing. The details of the cross-border movements of goods and services was never a campaign issue during the referendum, and I defy anyone to say that that was a key campaign issue. We campaigned on those big three things: borders, laws, and money. And those things are being delivered in this proposal.
Mehdi and Kate, you've been listening very patiently to all of this. What are your observations about whether the proposal as we've seen it, the broad proposal that came out of Chequers, is actually going to go through Parliament, and we will be looking at votes in the autumn, the meaningful vote on putting this through?
Well, a couple of things. One, what I find so fascinating listening to this debate is the way it's such an intra-party debate. Brexit has become a Conservative Party debate. We know about Labour ruction, etc., but this is an issue that affects the nation, the continent, the world in some ways. And I find it bizarre that you have, a David Davis white paper, a Chequers agreement, alternatives being thrown around. Are the Europeans going to sign up to any of them? Jeremy Corbyn's proposal, does that meet the European? I mean, that is the elephant in the room here, which is whatever's agreed on. I don't know what they're going to agree on. I don't think anyone here knows what's going to be agreed on. Almost certainly whatever's agreed on is going to fall short of what the rest of the European Union
So you think the European Union is going to demand more, as people would see it, concessions?
I think they've already made clear what some of their red lines are. And I think when we talk about hard Brexit, soft Brexit, medium Brexit, softer Brexit, the reality is, do any of those quote-unquote Brexit plans, and David mentioned clarity, there's no clarity in any of them, are they going to meet the bar for a successful negotiation? We're talking almost as if once it's all agreed, we're almost there. That's almost at the beginning, and yet there's a clock ticking as well.
Right.
We invoke Article 50 without having these debates, without having these discussions.
Does the Conservative Party stay together over this?
Oh gosh, I don't want to make any political predictions because who knows what's going to happen in a day or a week or a month. But I think if we look at the policy of it, the Chequers statement itself had contradictions. On one hand, it was saying that the UK was signed up to an EU common rule book. On the other hand, it was trying to suggest that the UK might be able to diverge on goods and agriculture in certain areas. So the white paper is going to clarify what it actually meant. I am concerned that if it really does mean the former, it doesn't matter if you're technically in the single market or not, similar to a customs union, the UK is not going to be able to negotiate with other countries and compromise with them to get the free trade deals that really were promised as part of the Brexit debate. It's starting to feel like that £40 billion divorce bill was actually not an agreement to get a free trade arrangement with the EU, but to be able to at least speak to them about something that they'd really like and to stop us from speaking to the rest of the world.
Right.
Just on the Conservative Party issue, I found it astonishing, then David said, that we've had this dividing line, but we've handled it well, we've stuck together. Let's be very clear, since 1979, 3 Conservative Prime Ministers, all in some way or another, have lost their jobs as a result of Europe. We're now on the verge of a 4th Prime Minister losing her job over Europe. That's one Conservative Party, which was once the greatest vote-winning machine in British history, basically torching its reputation over the last few decades over this never-ending row over the EU, the single market, the common market, whatever it's been called in various shades.
You're shaking your head and looking sceptical, James.
Sorry, so we just heard a quote. We've torched our reputation over the last few decades. Last time I remember, the 2017 general election saw us having the largest vote share and the largest totality of votes in.
And the same for the Labour Party.
Was that the result you were aiming for?
No, but
the polls.
So
I mean, come on. You know that wasn't a good result.
No, I didn't claim it was a good result. But
and you lost your majority.
The idea that people aren't voting for us is self-evidently a nonsense. This was always going to be a very difficult and very challenging thing to navigate. To be fair, emotions and passions on subjects relating to the EU have always existed on both sides of the house.
And it has brought down Prime Ministers.
Because we are in government, obviously the focus is more on us, and that's entirely appropriate. But the Labour Party is absolutely split down the middle on this issue.
They certainly are. But let's look again. I mentioned this tweet to David Jones, Marcus Fish, your Conservative colleague, who says Downing Street will give us Corbyn unless they change and change now. What do you say to him?
I tell you what is the thing that will most likely herald a Labour vote, and that's the Conservative Party not pulling together behind the Prime Minister. People do not vote for split parties, and I think that is the broader point you're making. And so my strong advice, as someone who campaigned passionately for leave, is that this proposal gives us the best chance of leaving the European Union. And for me, that is the prize. The things that people don't like, if it turns out that a future trade agreement requires us to diverge from the EU, then we can look at the economic opportunity of that trade agreement versus the consequences
So losing
of diverging
market access.
from the
But
EU.
isn't there a bit
And if
of a
one is
missed
more
opportunity
and if
here?
one is more valued than the other, then that makes sense.
I think for me, the frustrating part is that this has become a zero-sum game. I mean, I thought the goal was for the UK to get a free trade agreement with the EU and get other free trade agreements with the rest of the world. It really feels now, from this Chequers proposal, that the EU has boxed the UK into thinking you have to be with us or you have to be with them. We are still technically your largest market, so it's better to stay with us. I feel like we're losing the opportunities of Brexit.
Can I just ask one question? You said you were a passionate leaver. Would you agree, in hindsight at least, that this debate that we're having now, quote-unquote debate about rule books and trade and single market, shouldn't have this been had in 2016, or at least before Article 50 was invoked? It seems bizarre that you come at the end of the process and say, OK, now with a few months to go, we're going to work out what this massive relationship is going to look like.
Give me any occasion when the EU has ever decided something.
Not the EU, I'm talking about the UK should have that debate, rather than just drive around with a bus saying 350 million quid.
So
have an actual debate about the details.
So a negotiation requires decision-making on both parts. The EU never makes a decision except at the 11th hour. So there was an inevitability that this was always going to run long, and it was always going to be decided in the 11th hour. That is always the way they work. So there was an inevitability about this, and frankly, people weren't focused on the detail. I tried to have, I gave speeches on international trade and the implications of the EU. No one listened during the debate. They're listening now because, of course, it matters.
All right. Well, John, just a sort of final summation from you, but in terms of the EU, looking ahead, Leah Varadkar in Ireland did indicate that there would be flexibility on the EU side too. Do you think that that was genuine, sincerely held view of his?
I think Leah Varadkar and the Irish Republic want to get a deal done. The last thing that the Irish Republic wants on any analysis is for no deal to be the outcome of all of this, and for Britain to revert to the global rules of the World Trade Organization. This could be disastrous for the Irish economy. They've been playing hardball until now. As for where we go, it's also, although the splits in British politics are there for all of us to see, and no one can deny them, no matter how much they try. But don't forget, there are splits, ideological splits and political splits on the European side too. And even within Brussels, you have some inside the Commission, Mr. Selmayr, who's rather something like a religious supporter of the idea of the European project. You get the impression that Michel Barnier, the head negotiator, may turn out to be rather more, as some would argue, more pragmatic in seeking a deal. Maybe fancies a job somewhere high up in the hierarchy in the future. Who knows? But all of that has
political
to be
ambition.
And meanwhile, Downing Street is looking very strongly to member states to lean on Brussels to get something done.
All right.
Doesn't mean it necessarily will be.
All right. Thank you both very much, James and John.
Well, more than 2 years after the Brexit referendum, the government has published its detailed plans for future relations with the EU. The blueprint expands on last Friday's Chequers agreement that sparked the resignations of 2 cabinet ministers. The new Brexit secretary, Dominic Raab, said the white paper today was ambitious and pragmatic. Others say it is a plan for a bad deal for Britain. Our political editor, Laura Kuensberg, has been studying the contents.
Every now and then, in boring brown-looking boxes, are government documents that really, really matter. In there, Theresa May's plan for life outside the EU.
We've just come out of this morning's briefing. The document has been kept so tightly under wraps that we haven't actually been allowed to bring it out of the building. The white paper does in detail spell out a much closer relationship with the rest of the EU after Brexit that many Brexiteers had hoped for. But from the Prime Minister's point of view, it's time to compromise and accept we can't have it all.
The 98-page document spells out a common rule book for manufacturing. The UK will follow EU rules to avoid a hard border in Ireland. But the government isn't aiming for one big agreement on services, but new arrangements instead, to cover the vast majority of the economy. The overall deal will be policed by a new governing body. The European Court won't have the final say, but will interpret the rules. And while the government will end unlimited immigration from the EU, its citizens will be able to come without visas to do paid work in some circumstances, not yet defined. For those who like dramatic breaks with the established order, guess who? It's not as much of a separation as Brexit might have been. Before ministers had a chance to explain their plan, President Trump tried to do it for them.
I've been reading a lot about Brexit over the last couple of days, and it seems to be turning a little bit differently, where they're getting at least partially involved back with the European Union. I don't know if that's what they voted for.
Awkward, given that the Prime Minister was leaving for home to welcome the American president on his visit to the UK.
They voted for us to take back control of our money, our law and our borders, and that's exactly what we will do. We will stop sending vast contributions to the EU every year. We will ensure that the European Court of Justice doesn't have jurisdiction in the UK any longer, and we will ensure that we bring an end to free movement.
The white paper should have been made available. It will be immediately.
But the brand new Brexit secretary had some problems explaining at home.
As soon as it's practically possible.
Only at the very last minute did MPs see the plan. Boxes rushed into the Commons, copies being flung around. There was such a ruckus that the session was stopped.
I will therefore suspend the sitting of the House.
Smooth and orderly Brexit? Not quite.
Today has been shambolic for the government. It's evidence of how they're conducting negotiations. This white paper should have been published over a year ago. It's already overdue, and then it wasn't ready for scrutiny in Parliament. So shambles is an overused word in politics, but today it really describes what's gone on.
And how can the government squeeze it past the divided Brexiteers and former Remainers in the Tory party? We asked a strong member of each camp.
The UK government has compromised and compromised again. We've compromised too far.
These regulations aren't sort of monstrously unfeasible, unworkable regulations. I don't think either side, those who regret the result and those who want a complete break with Europe tomorrow morning, should start by dismissing what is in the white paper.
There is going to be a time for peace and reconciliation in the Conservative Party, but it's not now and it's not next week.
Keeping it friendly isn't likely, and voters on all sides might not be persuaded. Compromise never comes without a cost. Well, it's taken a very long time to get to what the government thinks is a sensible step forward. But it's unlikely the EU will just swallow it all. And it's not clear tonight that this plan as it stands would actually be able to get through Parliament. Some form of compromise was probably inevitable. But there's a fine line between bend and break.
Laura, thanks very much again for the latest there on the white paper. Laura Kuensberg at Westminster. Let's stay with the story because British firms, of course, big and small, have been waiting to see the shape of the proposed trade relations with the EU after Brexit. But do these plans today tackle the concerns of British business, especially in relation to trade, not only in goods, but also in services after the UK leaves the EU? Our business editor, Simon Jack, has been finding out.
Borders are bad for business. Delays can slow the wheels of trade. The government hoped today's white paper would reassure companies that goods travelling between the UK and the EU could carry on much as they do now by creating a free trade area using the EU rulebook on standards and regulations so no checks are needed. Vital to businesses like cheesemaker Richard Clothier.
Yeah, have a good sniff of that.
He exports over £10 million worth of cheddar to France every year. So what does he make of it?
I think it's a good white paper in terms of it sets out the intent to trade freely with Europe ongoing. I'm concerned about the practicality of administering customs, particularly within the food sector where the supply chains are really complex and there have been issues, in the past. So I think it'd be very difficult to sell this deal to Europe.
But it's finance more than food that feeds the UK economy. Services account for 80% of everything the UK earns, produces and consumes. Services like banking, law and insurance. And here the government's plan is different. Here at Lloyd's of London, tens of billions of euros worth of insurance cover are sold to European customers every year. And when it comes to services like finance, the white paper makes clear that there won't necessarily be a single rule book and there won't necessarily be business as usual. The city hoped the UK and the EU could respect each other's rule-making process without it being identical. The government thought that would be a hard sell in Brussels, so the UK is proposing to go its own way, which will make some services harder to sell in Europe. A mistake, say finance chiefs.
Professional financial services are really not catered for at all, and it's very disappointing. It's not providing the certainty we need, so if anything, it's going to accelerate our plans. Lloyd's, for instance, we're moving to Brussels. We will be full steam ahead, and many other banks, insurers and other professional service firms will be moving at pace now.
Business groups want more detail, more urgency and more cooperation from the EU.
They want the EU now to engage. We've had flexibility on our side. We now need similar constructiveness and flexibility on the EU side. This is time to get round the table because it's become, I think, for businesses a race against time.
This white paper is not a solution, it's an aspiration. The tough negotiations don't end, but start here. And business knows it. Simon Jack, BBC News.
Well, let's go live to Brussels from some reaction there. Our Europe editor, Katya Adler, is there for us. Katya, what's your sense of how they're likely to respond to this white paper?
Well, the EU response, Hugh, comes sort of in two sections, if you like, mood and content. The mood music here is pretty positive. I mean, the EU has been asking the UK for a long...
with minor injuries and intoxication.
...on how it imagines EU-UK relations to be like after Brexit. Well, now Brussels have it. Also, the EU sees that Theresa May is moving towards a softer Brexit, which the EU prefers. But when it comes to content, EU officials are far more cautious. We heard from Michel Barnier in a tweet today, the EU's chief negotiator. He said, we need time to analyse this white paper. Of course, it's a dense and a long white paper, but privately, the EU already rejects large parts of the white paper, but it sees it as a springboard to restart face-to-face negotiations this Monday. Another reason why EU leaders today are reluctant to comment in detail is because they see that febrile political atmosphere back in the UK, and they think that whatever they may comment or criticise in the white paper could just add fuel to the fire.
Katya, thank you so much.
Now, almost a week after Theresa May's showdown at Chequers that led to David Davis, Boris Johnson and various others you probably haven't heard of quitting the government, the Brexit white paper has been revealed, detailing Britain's negotiating position for life after we leave the EU. Theresa May declared it absolutely delivers on the Brexit we voted for. But many Tory Eurosceptics disagree, and Labour attacked it as muddled and bad for Britain. Those divisions mean that instead of clarity, many feel there's more uncertainty than ever as we get closer to the no-deal cliff edge in March next year. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, reports.
I think we'll hear the Members of Parliament rush in, chucking bundles of the government's Brexit policy out to fellow MPs. The brand new Secretary of State had been trying to take questions before MPs were given the chance to read it. But the Speaker said piles of copies sitting in an office right next to the chamber must be handed out immediately. Members of Parliament should have a copy of the white paper.
It will be immediately. It will be made available as soon as is practically possible.
The session was briefly suspended to give MPs time to read it. I will therefore suspend the sitting of the House for 5 When they got their hands on it, MPs saw the white paper proposes what it calls a common rule book. The UK would apply EU rules on manufactured and agricultural goods. Where there was disagreement on rulings, reference would be made up to the European Court of Justice. The much bigger services sector would face barriers to trade with the EU, staying outside its rules. EU citizens would be able to travel to the UK for temporary business activity without a visa. A new customs arrangement could come into force around 2022. For 1 hour, it was relentless critical questioning from pro-Brexit Tory MPs. Was the government going to trade a softer immigration policy with the EU for economic benefits?
The people voted for Brexit because they wanted to control migration, and they don't want to be sold down the river on this point as the negotiations proceed.
Was the common rule book just the single market dressed up?
How can he justify the use of the adjective common in describing the noun rule book when he's committed to ongoing harmonisation, even with a parliamentary process? It is their rule book, isn't it?
I have deep misgivings about what the government is proposing, but I would like, having voted to leave, I voted to leave, not to half leave.
But it's not for me to say.
President Trump in Brussels misheard a question about hard Brexit and then plunged in, siding with critics of Theresa May's new Brexit policy.
Oh, hard Brexit, I said. I thought you said it was heartbreaking. I said that might be going a little bit too far, right? Heartbreaking. Is it heartbreaking? A lot of things are heartbreaking. No, I would say that, you know, Brexit is Brexit. It's not like, I guess when you use the term hard Brexit, I assume that's what you mean. The people voted to break it up. So I would imagine that's what they'll do, but maybe they'll take it a little bit of a different route. So I don't know if that's what they voted for. I just want the people to be happy. They're great people.
Theresa May, before leaving the NATO summit in Brussels, insisted her policy would get a good hearing across town at the European Union's headquarters.
What we've heard so far from other leaders and from Brussels is actually a positive response, that this is a proposal that we can sit down and start increasing the pace of the negotiations on this particular issue.
Many in Parliament have been working on decision trees to see what might happen next. In theory, what could happen now is that the Chequers deal is signed off by the EU and presented to Parliament for approval, which MPs duly give.
What is the probability that Brussels, the EU 27, look at this white paper today and just say, all of it, absolutely fine, where do we sign?
0% probability of that happening. The EU sees this as an opening gambit.
The EU is certain to demand concessions, making this even more unpalatable to many Tory MPs. Some think 60 to 100 Tory MPs could oppose it. Does the Prime Minister then try to get pro-EU Labour MPs' support? What would it take to get that?
I think if Theresa May were to come forward with a proposition which was more like a customs union and the single market, she would find that there was a majority in the House for it, including a significant number of Labour MPs, if not all of the Labour Party.
That means losing the Conservative Party in the process. Big chunk of it.
The Prime Minister's got to get it into her head she's not just the leader of the Conservative Party, and the Conservative Party hasn't a majority in the House of Commons. She's the Prime Minister.
If all Labour MPs oppose the deal and a few Tories rebel, there could be no deal, and we could be very close to crashing out in March 2019. Some Brexiteers say that's when the EU gives in under pressure and makes concessions.
You would suddenly find the German car industry and the French wine producers saying to their own governments, come on, get on with it, we need to do a deal.
But if it's no deal and nobody's budging, some think that could be when MPs take things in a different direction, perhaps demanding another referendum, or deciding we need more time and we're staying in for longer.
Mr Barnier plays us along for time, we begin to look like we're running out of time, and then the establishment in this country start to ask for a suspension of Article 50.
When politics become dysfunctional like this, and when you're up against a very tight timetable and deadline, what tends to happen is that the likelihood of the extremes increase. So I think what has happened last week is that the likelihood of an extension of Article 50 or even, Brexit being stopped, even though I think that's unlikely, had probably gone up. Or certainly soft Brexit has gone up. But equally, I think a hard Brexit or a disorderly Brexit or a WTO Brexit has also gone up, because we just don't know exactly how politics will play out.
A fuller EU response is expected soon. Yesterday, cameras at the NATO summit picked up images of a stumbling European Commission President, Jean-Claude Juncker. As President Macron greets him, he's shaky on his feet. Later, the presidents of Finland and Ukraine appear to be propping him up. After descending from the stage, the Dutch Prime Minister and the Prime Minister of Portugal lend supporting hands. Both of them later said Mr. Juncker had been troubled by a bad back.
Well, one of the key objectives of the White Paper is to create a new economic partnership with the EU, reflecting pressure from many business groups that there should be as little disruption as possible after Brexit. Today, industry got some of what it wanted, though it still needs more detail in many key areas. But financial services gave a very different story, warning it was a blow to them. Mrs May has been under pressure from the city and industry for a clear picture of how we will trade with the EU after we leave. Today, it was industry that heard a bit more of what it wanted. The government thinks it can minimise any disruption at our ports by setting up a system to collect customs for both the UK and the EU as goods move in and out of the country. Business organisations like the idea, but wonder if it's practical. One has suggested it could take 10 years to set up. Industry also has questions about what will replace free movement of people. It fears government talk of allowing in the brightest and the best ignores their need for workers of all skills. And any replication of the current system for non-EU migrants will bring more bureaucracy and extra cost. And the Prime Minister is also struggling to keep the city happy. Financial services companies approved in London can currently sell their products across Europe. The city hoped that system would be replaced by new rules mutually recognised by the UK and the EU. But there's no sign of that in the White Paper, and little detail on what will happen, though the government makes clear there will be less access to European markets in the future. Well, earlier I spoke to Carolyn Fairburn, Director General of the CBI, and I asked her if she was happy with the White Paper.
Chequers last week and then the White Paper today has put forward at least some serious proposals, particularly on goods. Gaps on services, still a lot of white space to be filled in, but it's progress and something that can at least get us around the negotiating table with the European Union.
If the CBI is saying this is progress, the Brexiteers are going to say, well, that's not the progress we want.
Well,
because they see you as the sort of the voice of Remain.
Well, we are. I think this is all about jobs, and I think that what businesses tried to do is put evidence on the table, really practical evidence about what this means at borders, what this means for just-in-time manufacturing. That's not about leave or remain.
Do you think those warnings from people like Airbus and BMW have helped?
I think they're very real. I think that the thing that is important in all of this is to realise these are real jobs, they're goods crossing borders, people actually making things, and that I don't think had come out enough. We have spoken to lots of companies who are uncomfortable about speaking out because actually they are worried that their German competitor will take their business if they do. Politicians
from different parties are against this for different reasons. You've got the hard Brexiteers in the Conservative Party who are going to vote against it, and you've got Labour on the other side dicing with the idea of voting against it because they think they might get into power if they defeat the government on this. What is your message to these people?
And what do I think you have got from a business community? You know, we're not politicians. What we want is for politicians everywhere, and it's talking about the EU as well, to put the national interest first, look at the evidence, put ideology to one side. This is so serious.
The government is making a great deal of saying freedom of movement will be over. You know, that's gone. It's very clear in the White Paper. And yet there are all sorts of suggestions within that White Paper that certain sectors will still have mobility or people will be able to move in and out of the country. I mean, how important is that to you?
It's incredibly important. And particularly, I would say, the mobility of people. I think sometimes we don't distinguish enough in our debate between immigration, people moving here permanently, and the mobility that you need for trade and for business. You know, we are an 80% services economy. Services are largely about people. They are film editors moving across borders. They are data programmers moving in for a project. And what I think this White Paper does do, it recognises the need for the mobility of people working in services. Freedom of movement, I think everybody recognises, as we know, it will end. That came out, business recognises that. But what we put in its place, I think that's the big question.
I mean, you're appealing for Europe to come around the table, for politicians to put the national interest first now. I mean, this is starting to sound a bit desperate.
It's not desperation. I think it's pragmatism and that recognition that that clock carries on ticking.
But there are loads of Brexit voters out there who don't care about the clock ticking. You know, who say, well, it doesn't matter if we get no deal. We'll sort it all out eventually and Britain can prosper.
150,000 businesses that only export to Europe. They have no means of putting in place technology to deal with customs, tariffs and blocks. I would just ask them to look at the evidence on that. It's a very competitive world at the moment. We have got great businesses in this country. Do we really want to put a brake on them right now? I think it'd be a very bad thing for our country.
Carolyn Fairburn from the CBI.
Now, if the government was hoping to prove to Donald Trump that its handling of the Brexit process was going well, today's chaotic scenes in the House of Commons must have made them wince with embarrassment. Uproar greeted the new Brexit Secretary Dominic Raab as he introduced the White Paper detailing the government's negotiating position. The session was briefly suspended after furious MPs protested that they hadn't received copies in advance, as they're supposed to do.
Secretary Dominic Raab.
Big day for the new Brexit Secretary, at last presenting the government's Brexit plans more than 2 years after the UK voted to leave the EU. But then uproar, proceedings suspended.
It is most regrettable that this situation has arisen.
Why? Well, because MPs were furious that journalists had been briefed, but they weren't, so copies were distributed in an unconventional way.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr.
This is our vision for a bold, ambitious and innovative new partnership with the EU. Principled and practical, faithful to the referendum, it delivers a deal that is good for the UK and good for our EU friends.
But Labour wasn't enthusiastic.
Can I gently say this? He's not got off to a very good start. The utter shambles of the last 20 minutes that led to the suspension of the House during a statement is clear evidence, Mr. Speaker, of why the government is in such a mess.
But the opposition was perhaps most savage from Mr Raab's own backbenchers, especially from disappointed Brexiters.
Having voted to leave, I voted to leave, not to half leave.
The people voted for Brexit because they wanted to control migration, and they don't want to be sold down the river on this point.
I am deeply worried indeed about the proposals that I've read already in this white paper.
What they hate in this 98-page document is that the Prime Minister wants the UK to follow forever EU rules on the production and consumption of food and goods, and also collect tariffs for the EU at our borders. The PM in Brussels tried to reassure.
We will stop sending vast contributions to the EU every year. We will ensure that the European Court of Justice doesn't have jurisdiction in the UK any longer. And we will ensure that we bring an end to free movement. That's an absolute guarantee.
Jean-Claude Juncker, the EU Commission President, a bit, well, wobbly last night. And as officials tell me, they're more than wobbly on the UK's Brexit offer. So here's the funny thing. Theresa May's deal is hated by her own Tory MPs who see themselves as the guardians of a true Brexit, and probably equally disliked by the European Union's officials and governments who see themselves as defenders of what the EU itself stands for. No one said getting out of the EU would be easy, or did they? Robert Peston, News at 10.
And of course, there was a Brexit story today, even before President Trump's stunning intervention this evening. The new Brexit Secretary, Dominic Raab, was up in Parliament to deliver the long-awaited white paper, fleshing out that Chequers deal. There was mixed reaction to the detail. Some in Europe suggested it had been a positive week for Brexit, while the Scottish Government said the plans would harm the Scottish economy. But can the government even get the plans past Parliament now? Well, here's Nick Watt again on the mounting pressures against the Prime Minister's plans for Brexit.
In the ever-chaotic game of Brexit, rebels turn into loyalists and loyalists turn into rebels. Last week, Remainers were on the outside. Now, it's the turn of Brexiteers.
Order. Can I say to the Secretary of State...
The sense of unease was highlighted when the Brexit White Paper was launched amid disorderly scenes in Parliament.
That it would be very unseemly, discourteous to him and to the members of the House for his statement to be delivered while copies are being distributed.
The House was briefly suspended as MPs, armed with boxes of the document, started dishing them out to colleagues.
Cock-up rather than conspiracy was the view of one cabinet minister for the tardy publication of the White Paper. But those scenes in Parliament symbolise the bumpy journey Theresa May now faces after finally setting out her vision for Britain's future relationship with the EU.
Planting her flag so firmly in soft Brexit territory prompted Remainer Tories, who came close to rebelling a few weeks ago, to move closer to the government. Brexiteers are now threatening to defeat the government in Parliament. Leavers want to unravel the Prime Minister's Chequers deal, which is to maintain the closest possible relations with the EU while preserving her red lines. The White Paper sets out plans for an association agreement, which includes a common rulebook to ensure goods can flow easily in a free trade area, a new customs arrangement which would see the UK collecting some EU tariffs, a diminished but continuing role for the European Court of Justice, and an end to free movement of people, but an automatic right to work for highly skilled people. A former Brexit minister warned the government could face defeat unless it changes tack.
There's certainly a great deal of strength of feeling. People are concerned about these proposals. But really, I think also it's going to demonstrate to the government that it needs to take the entire Conservative Party with it. And at the moment, the proposals that we've seen don't do that. The government can't rely upon the Labour Party to get these proposals through. It needs a united Conservative Party. And I think, therefore, it's important that they come back to us talk to us about these proposals and try to achieve a position that all the Parliamentary Conservative Party want, not just a faction of the party.
Pro-Europeans warned of the dangers of rejecting the White Paper.
I think it would be a great shame if this was sabotaged, and I think it offers a very pragmatic way forward, and I think it's just one of those things that we could find ourselves heading towards the cliff of a walk-away, no-deal Brexit. And if that's the case, I think the government, in their contingency planning for no deal, because they've said they're going to step that up, they should also publish very clearly what they're planning for, because I think if the public could see the extent of the disruption that might cause, they'd be a lot more concerned about that.
The parliamentary arithmetic could work against Theresa May if angry Brexiteers eventually find common cause with a Labour Party keen to unseat the Prime Minister.
When Article 50 was triggered, that we would have 6 tests for the Article 50 deal that the Prime Minister brought back. We'll apply those 6 tests. We've also argued that no deal is completely unacceptable. I don't think Parliament would ever allow the Prime Minister to take us out without a deal. It would be a disaster for us and for the EU.
Theresa May has made her move. Opponents in various guises are lying in wait and preparing their own counter moves.
Nick Watt. Well, this was the week when the erstwhile Tory Remainer rebels got a smile put back on their faces, and Brexiteers who'd previously backed the government themselves threatened to rebel. To discuss the role reversal, we're joined now by the MPs Dominic Grieve and Anne-Marie Morris. Anne-Marie, if I can turn to you first, what's your reaction to Donald Trump's interview in The Sun dissing the Chequers deal?
Well, I think that it's right that the White Paper does not deliver Brexit, but at the end of the day, the reason that Brexit's so important is we want an independent view and a decision by the British people. So, interesting that we have this view expressed by the US President, but at the end of the day, this is our issue and our challenge. And as to the trade deal being off, we've heard this before. We've heard back of the queue, front of the queue, not in the queue. So, let's see. I think we've got a way to go before we actually finalise any sort of deal with the US.
And do you agree with him that Boris would be a great PM?
I think who's going to be the leader is not the issue now. The issue now is delivering Brexit.
But, I mean, it's interesting because you thought it was game on for a hard breakfast, but actually you were wrong-footed. I mean, is there any way that you can vote for this White Paper?
I can't vote for this White Paper. No, I can't.
And what are you most unhappy about? What's your red line?
For me, Brexit was about delivering control back. It was about our sovereignty. And what has happened is 2 things. One, we have lost control of the rule book, and the ECJ, I'm afraid, still reigns supreme.
Because it's the final court of appeal for European countries.
Also because the law will apply indirectly, and then if there is ever an appeal, an adjudication, then that is subject to ECJ rules and regulations. But the other challenge actually is the one, the point that Trump makes, which is we cannot do trade deals. It's not just the US, but it is as much the non-tariff issues as the tariff issue.
But you said yourself that you've been at the back of the queue, the front of the queue, the back of the queue for an American trade deal, and actually it was all bluster.
Well, let's see where we get to. I don't think you can ever say game off. I mean, that really is writing it off a bit too early, don't you think, Kirsty?
So you've got a resignation from, David Davis, you've got resignation from Boris. Would you like to have seen Michael Gove walk away, or did he do the right thing by staying and being pragmatic?
I think he did the right thing because, Kirsty, in my view, you need somebody inside the tent and somebody outside the tent, which is what most of the military would tell you.
Yes, but the thing was that the first thing that Michael Gove did was he went on Andrew Marr on Sunday and actually backed the deal, so he's not any help to you.
He is not any help to me,
no.
But he is trying to find a way. Because think about it, Kirsty.
What can he achieve? I mean, he absolutely has signed up to that White Paper. He signed up to the Common Rule Book. He signed up to everything. So he's absolutely of no use to you whatsoever.
Yes, he is. Because at the end of the day, Kirsty, we may have got the ink on the paper, but that has not gone through Parliament, and it hasn't been agreed by Brussels either. So there is still all to play for. Okay, let's find the middle way.
How confident are you that you can stop it?
I would say confident is probably not the right term. I know you talk about we Brexiteers having taken over. We're not confident. The most important thing is to deliver the will of the British people.
But you might have the backing of Labour MPs.
Who knows? Who knows? I don't think anybody can foreguess that.
You said that the leader actually wasn't the key point at the moment, but actually, are you prepared, if you have to bring down Theresa May over this white paper?
My draft has not been written, but my view is that we need to look at events as they unfold. It's events, dear boy, events. Let us see what happens. For me, the key is delivering Brexit.
But I think what people want to know is are you prepared? Is Brexit and the Brexit that you want so important that if, in order to get it, you had to unseat Theresa May, you would do that?
I don't think that is what people want to know. I think what they want to know is that they've got members of Parliament prepared to do their best with whatever government you have to deliver Brexit.
Thank you very much indeed. Dominic Grieve, just turning to you. First of all, again, on The Sun, you were, of course, the big rebel, and now you're one of the government cheerleaders for this deal. Has Donald Trump given you a headache tonight?
Not at all. Let's face it, my view has always been that there's almost zero chance of doing a trade deal with the United States. It's sliding into protectionism, and the terms of any deal are likely, in any event, to be unacceptable. And that's been my long-held view. I think that these trade deals which have been marketed, it'd be possible possibly to do one with Australia and New Zealand. The other countries that have been listed, I think it's almost impossible. And that's one of the reasons, of course, why I campaigned for Remain, because our principal trading partners are within the European Union and are going to be for some time to come, if not always. And that's where we ought to have frictionless trade.
But at the moment, you go with this white paper, and this will not be the end of the story. The EU is going to want to negotiate further. That'll be music to your ears, but that will give Theresa May more problems.
I'm the first to accept that the white paper is far from perfect for a whole variety of reasons. But last Friday, it looked as if the Cabinet had come together on a position which seemed to me to be rational and coherent for starting the necessary negotiations with our EU partners. And the Prime Minister has my support in endeavouring to do that. And we've got to then see what she can return with.
But as rebels, you, I would say, were probably quite soft-hearted. You seem to be quite soft-hearted. Now you've got Anne-Marie here, is prepared to go further and actually will have, perhaps, the cohorts of Labour behind her.
Well, we shall have to wait and see what happens.
You heard Keir Starmer, if it doesn't pass the 6 tests.
I know exactly what Keir Starmer's 6 tests are all about, and I suspect that ultimately the front bench of the Labour Party is only interested in triggering a general election because they'd like to put Jeremy Corbyn into Downing Street. And I don't wish to see Jeremy Corbyn in Downing Street because I think he would be disastrous for my country. Now, that having been said, I also happen to believe that a hard Brexit will be totally disastrous for the United Kingdom, and I'm going to continue to work with my colleagues at Westminster, across party if necessary, to try to ensure that we minimise the risks which are massive from Brexit and try to end up with something which actually is workable for our country and which gets the maximum amount of public approval.
Now, you heard Keir Starmer say there, under no circumstances will they go for a no-deal Brexit. I'm not sure how that's going to square with working with the rebels.
That. There's no possibility of there being a no-deal Brexit.
Well,
it would be so damaging to the United Kingdom for that to happen that no rational parliamentarian
hang on,
could
if you can't get the bill through Parliament and the figures don't add up, that's exactly what's going to happen.
Well, if that happens, then Parliament will have to intervene. I think will almost certainly happen, and I doubt very much the government will survive the process.
And we'll have another general election. Thank you both very much indeed.